My name is Francisco de Almeida. You killed my only son. Prepare to die. It had been 9 months since the Battle of Diu, 9 months since the Portuguese were forced to flee, 9 months since Francisco de Almeida's only son, Lourenço, had perished. Diu had been a disaster for the Portuguese. It was now clear to all that the Europeans could be beaten. Perhaps they could be destroyed altogether. However, the Mamluk Armada had only won a Pyrrhic victory. It had taken horrendous losses, and along with its allies, they were forced to limp their way back to the City of Diu. Almeida knew that if Diu was not avenged and quickly, his enemies would only grow stronger and bolder. The Portuguese Empire in India, with its vast wealth and spice, would be severely threatened, and there was even potential that it could fall entirely. But the Mamluks had made a grave mistake. They had only killed the son of the viceroy. As Francisco would later say, he who eats the chicken must also eat the rooster or pay the price. It wasn't long after the Battle of Diu in early 1508 that the monsoons had come. Storms ravaged the Malabar coast. Any naval expedition would simply have to wait. The Viceroy of India wasted no time. He began to assemble a grand fleet, bringing in every ship he could find. Francisco spent that year personally training his crews to the peak of performance. He was determined to make his men into killing machines. By December of 1508, he had 18 ships and 1,200 men. They all seemed to share a sense of vengeance with their commander, who had promised them knighthood, plunder, amnesty, and even pardon for those on the bottom rung. Make no mistake, for Almeida, this wasn't just about fighting for his king and for his country. This coming fight was deeply personal. However, Francisco knew that he was running out of time. The King of Portugal, Manuel I, had obviously lost favor in him. Every month, an envoy would arrive from Portugal with an unending list of royal grievances. It was absolutely clear that Almeida's rivals in the royal court of Lisbon had been busy turning the king against him. King Manuel now wanted Almeida not just replaced, but sent home in utter disgrace. Regardless, Francisco continued his preparations. He dutifully sent the spice ships back to Portugal, and by early December of 1508, his war fleet was nearly ready to sail. As the date of his departure came near, he composed a letter to the king which outlined his plan. In the words he wrote, it was obvious that this, for him, was both a personal and a holy war. Indeed, his letter read almost like a final will and testament. Quote, I have a great desire to write to your highness, as I have determined to leave a memory. Whatever happens to me, my son is dead, as God willed and my sins deserved. The Venetians and the Sultan's Muslims killed him. It seems to me that this year we cannot avoid a trial of strength with them, which is the thing I most desire, because it seems to me that with God's help we have to remove them totally from the sea, so that they do not return to this land. And if our Lord is served by my ending my days in this way, I will have obtained the rest I seek, to see my son in glory." End quote. Almeida finished his letter on December 5, 1508 on board the Flor de la Mar. He knew that this coming battle would forever shape the fortunes of Portugal and India. The man resigned himself to the fight ahead. In his mind, he was prepared to die. The next day, December 6, 1508, the Viceroy of India walked sternly up to the bridge of his ship, the Flor de la Mar, or in Portuguese, the Frol de la Mar. The massive 400-ton carrack was a legend in the Portuguese Navy. She had made the India run more times than any other ship. She had been under the command of Vasco da Gama when he bombarded Calicut, participated in the capture of the island of Socotra, and her journey was far from over. The Flor de la Mar was now a massive gun platform and the flagship of Almeida's armada, but as fate would have it, she was soon to be a commandeered ship, as Francisco de Almeida was soon to be a fugitive. It was on this very day that Alfonso de Albuquerque, who was coming in from his defeat at the city of Ormuz in the Persian Gulf, arrived in India. Albuquerque first pulled into port at Kannur, but eventually made his way down to Cochin. In his hand was a letter from King Manuel appointing him the next governor. Almeida's time was up. The meeting between the two commanders was going to be awkward at best. Alfonso, despite his fierce personality, tried to be polite in taking over command. Francisco, however, held Alfonso in complete contempt as he had abandoned his position in the Red Sea, thereby allowing the Mamluk fleet to enter the Indian Ocean. This basically implied that he felt Alfonso de Albuquerque was in part responsible for his son's death. As expected, Francisco de Almeida refused to step down, stating that his position as viceroy didn't end until January. Furthermore, he argued he was about to engage the enemy. Alfonso, on the other hand, wasn't going to back down either, and insisted that he be the one to take command of the fleet and hunt down the Mamluk Armada himself. A massive confrontation that would drag the Portuguese into civil war was about to happen. But then, suddenly, on December 9th, Alfonso de Albuquerque awoke in Cochin to find both the viceroy and his armada gone. Roger Crowley in the book The Conquerors explains, quote, Almeida had sailed up the west coast of India, impelled by powerful forces both personal and strategic. However, in refusing to cede the governorship of India to Albuquerque, he was now openly disobeying the king. He was convinced that a showdown with the Egyptian fleet was necessary for the security of the Portuguese enterprise. At the same time, he sought revenge. But whatever the consequences for himself, if he ever made it back to Lisbon, he had decided to take the law into his own hands. End quote. The Portuguese armada that sailed from Cochin under the command of Francisco de Almeida in late 1508 was the best trained and equipped fleet that Portugal had yet brought to bear. As it made its way up the Malabar coast, it raided and looted and destroyed any enemy it encountered. Its passage was to be a demonstration of power. By late December, Francisco de Almeida had arrived at the city of Diu, the place where his son had failed to attack in 1506. It was a very wealthy city that had sided with his enemies in the past, and as such, Almeida was determined that it would serve as an example to those who would dare to defy the Portuguese. As the city of Diu came into view, Francisco told his captains that they would not only have to capture the city, but as he himself would say, they needed to instill terror in the enemy so that they remained completely traumatized. In the viceroy's mind, they had helped to kill his son. He wanted them to be more than just defeated. He wanted them to be broken. What's more, he wanted that terror to be transmitted to all of his adversaries who were still laying in wait. He wanted his qualities known amongst his enemies before he ever met them. Roger Crowley gives the account of the massacre that ensued. Quote, Almeida's captains obeyed his instructions to the letter. On December 31st at dawn, his ships launched a heavy bombardment alongside simultaneous amphibious landings. The wooden walls of the city soon fell, and as the garrison fled in disarray, the Portuguese pursued them. What followed was a black day in the history of European conquest that would leave the Portuguese cursed on Indian soil. Taken by surprise, the people of the city fled in all directions. The slaughter was indiscriminate. Women and men, young and old, all went down before the sword. Little children were ripped from the arms of their terrified mothers, dangled by their feet, and dashed against walls. In places, resistance was valiant but futile. End quote. The city was systematically looted and then burned to the ground. People that had taken shelter in basements and mosques were incinerated alive. The massacre of Diu would live forever in the memories of the few people who survived. It would rank alongside Vasco da Gama's destruction of the pilgrim ship the Miri. With his work done, Almeida departed Diu on January 5th, 1509. The fleet made its way north and soon arrived at the city of Chal, where his son had died. A large tribute was demanded from the city, and it was amassed without question. A pile of gold was waiting for the viceroy when he arrived, but when his forces disembarked to collect it, they found the entire city was empty. Everyone had fled. Almeida's shock and awe was clearly having the effect he wanted. By late January of 1509, Francisco had moved on to the island of Mumbai to repair and refit his ships before the final push on Diu. All 18 of his ships and 1,200 of his men had survived thus far. It was here that he got a letter from Malik Ayaz, the governor of Diu, who had participated at the Battle of Chal. Keep in mind, it was Malik's men who most likely had killed Francisco's son. Now that said, the loyalty of Malik Ayaz was still up for grabs, and he was ready to cut a deal with the Portuguese. He offered friendship, money, tribute, and the return of the prisoners he had taken at Chal. Malik even revealed the composition of the Mamluk fleet, hoping to persuade the viceroy. Francisco de Almeida's response, however, was not quite what Malik was expecting. Quote, "I, the Viceroy, address you, the most honorable Malik Ayaz, to let you know that I am on my way to your city, to seek out the men sheltering there after fighting with mine at Chal and killing a man known to be my son. I am coming with the hope of God on high to wreak vengeance on them and to those who help them. And if I don't find them, your city will not escape me. It will repay me for everything, and so will you, who gave them such great help at Chal. I am informing you of this so that you are fully aware of it when I arrive. Know that I am on my way." End quote. The city of Diu was blessed with a magnificent harbor. There was space for hundreds of ships. Inside were impressive dry dock facilities. At the entrance, there was a chain that spanned the water, and there was even multiple shore batteries that provided protection. The Mamluk admiral, Emir Hussein al-Kurdi, had 6 Mamluk galleys and 6 European-style carracks. His ally, the aforementioned governor of the city, Malik Ayaz, had 30 light galleys and 4 Gujarati carracks. Their strength had also been bolstered by reinforcements. The Zamorin, the king of the city of Calicut, who really wanted to see the Portuguese go down, had sent in an additional 100 smaller ships. Altogether, there were over 140 vessels that held 5,000 fighting men, along with 450 elite Mamluk warriors. However, despite their superiority in numbers, their leadership was heavily divided by mistrust and indecisiveness with tactical planning. Emir Hussein, who had struggled to keep his ships seaworthy and to keep his men from deserting, wanted to sail out and engage the Portuguese on the ocean before they could organize into a battle formation. Malik Ayaz and the Zamoran ships, which were less seaworthy, wanted to fight in the harbor where they'd be more effective and be safeguarded by the shore batteries. Malik also wanted to protect his city and felt that the Mamluks would most likely cut and run if they were to leave the waterfront. Eventually, after a lot of infighting, the commanders decided that they would fight within the confines of the city. On February 2, 1509, the Portuguese came into sight. They were exhausted from their long voyage, and so they kept their distance to rest and consolidate their tactical formation. Malik Ayaz ordered his men to sail out and harass their enemy, but they never ventured past the range of their shore batteries, which basically gave the Portuguese time to organize. The next day, February 3rd, the wind shifted into favor at approximately 11 a.m. Everyone in the Portuguese fleet knew exactly what that meant. Francisco de Almeida ordered the royal standard raised and a single cannon to be fired on the Flor de la Mar. This was his signal to attack. The Mamluks had adopted a similar tactical formation as they had at the Battle of Chal. Along the shoreline near the entrance to the harbor, they had anchored their ships side by side closely together in a static position. Here they would not only be protected by the guns of the city and the Fort of Diu, but they would also be able to provide close support for one another. Yet by adopting this formation, they had completely surrendered the initiative to the Portuguese viceroy. Malik Ayaz and the ships at Calicut, meanwhile, remained further back in the harbor. Malik had wagered that Almeida, like his son, would immediately attack the Mamluk ships, engaging them at point-blank range with grappling hooks and boarding parties and avoiding long-range bombardment. His plan was to come in on the flank and the rear of the Portuguese once they were heavily engaged with the Mamluks. Now, oddly enough, Malik had intentionally not raised the heavy chain that protected the harbor, which would have effectively banned the Portuguese from entering. Some historians argue that Malik did this as he was still trying to gain Almeida's favor. Looking on from his bridge, the Portuguese viceroy astutely took in the tactical and strategic scenario. He knew this would be a pivotal battle, as he was later remembered saying to his men, "Be certain that in conquering this fleet, we will conquer all of India." Then as he and his men uttered the cry, "Santiago," the Portuguese fleet moved in. Seeing their adversary approach, the shore batteries were primed and began to open fire. The lead ship, the Santo Espirito, took several direct hits. The men on its forward deck were killed instantly. As the rest of the ships came into range, they too came under intense cannon fire. But despite taking casualties and being shot at from several sides, they pushed on and made their way into the main harbor. Almeida knew he was outnumbered, so he divided his fleet into several attack groups. Each had been instructed in exactly what to do. The first group was instructed to bombard the enemy at a distance. They trained their cannons to shoot directly into the water. The cannonballs thus bounced over the waves like skipping stones and slammed into the Mamluk ships just above the waterline. The second group was commanded to move in, grapple, and then board the Muslim ships. This contingent was led by the Santo Espirito, which pulled up alongside the ship next to Emir Hussein's flagship. The Santo Espirito unleashed a devastating broadside at point-blank range. Cannonballs tore through her target. The Mamluk ship receiving the fire shuddered from the blast, keeled over, and immediately began to sink, drowning everyone on board. The rest of the second group of ships closed in and repeated this maneuver, blasting their assigned targets at close range. But then a deafening roar came from both sides as Hussein's men began to return fire. Smoke billowed out from all the ships, blotting out the sun. Casualties began to mount on both sides, but the Mamluks, despite having skilled gunners, were limited by their formation and being able to unleash their full broadsides. It was at this point that the Portuguese had moved into position to begin grappling and boarding their opponents. The Santo Espirito attempted to board Hussein's flagship, but just as Portuguese soldiers started to go across, an Egyptian carrack, using its anchor lines, moved in and sandwiched the Portuguese ship, which now had to take up a defensive position and came near to being captured. However, the nearby Rey Grande, seeing this unfold, changed course and rammed Hussein's ship on the other side. Emir Hussein's men raced to confront the new threat, and the battle shifted once again into Portugal's favor. All along the line, broadsides were being unleashed, men were fighting hand-to-hand, and arrows and small gunfire filled the air. Malik Ayaz, meanwhile, watched on, from a distance, on the shore. Even from his vantage point, he could tell that the Portuguese tactics and maneuverability were slowly winning the day. Almeida's men may have been outnumbered, but their cannons, not to mention their plate and chain armor, had made them near invincible. One Mamluk ship after another was being overwhelmed with the ferocity of the Portuguese attack. It was at this point that Malik finally gave the order for his ships, along with his Calicut allies, to sail in on the Portuguese rear. Perhaps there was still a chance he could turn the tide. Francisco de Almeida, however, had anticipated this. He had created one last battle group which consisted of two ships, the Flor de la Mar and the São Antonio. He had kept his flagship back at a distance in the middle of the harbor where he could better take in the entire fight and give commands to his men. The São Antonio was deployed midway as a communication ship that conveyed his orders directly to his men. But the Flor de la Mar was directly positioned in this way to intercept the ships of Diu and Calicut. It was essentially one ship against many, but as this fleet moved in, the Flor de la Mar opened up on them. The initial broadsides were so violent that they shook Almeida's flagship to its core. Wooden beams groaned and the mighty ship began to come apart. Francisco immediately deployed his men for damage control. He knew he had to repair his ship. If the Flor de la Mar sank, the battle would have been lost. Miraculously, the ship held together and continued to unleash one volley after another. As luck would have it, the wind shifted and the current began to slow down. This brought Malik's ships to a near standstill, a perfect target for experienced Portuguese gunners to take them down. Throughout the day, the Flor de la Mar continued to fire its broadsides. It was said that the flagship unloaded over 600 rounds. At one point, Almeida had inflicted so much damage that the floating remains of his opponent's ships became an obstacle. The incoming Gujarati Carracks were heavily damaged. Some were reduced to skeleton crews as their casualties skyrocketed. The ships at Calicut, meanwhile, only stood up to a volley or two before turning back and then retreating from the harbor altogether. The Flor de la Mar had effectively stopped this incoming fleet, in some places literally dead in their tracks. The fate of the Mamluk ships was now sealed. Fighting would continue down the line for the rest of the day. Amir Hussein's men did fight back ferociously. Indeed, a third of Almeida's men would be wounded. But the tide of battle had definitively shifted. The Portuguese were handing out death wholesale. A chronicler at the time would lament, "The sea was red with the blood of the dead." Eventually, even Amir Hussein's flagship was taken by a combined assault. The Mamluk admiral at the last moment decided to abandon ship and escaped in a longboat. Now only one Mamluk ship was left, the largest Carrack of the fleet. The Portuguese swarmed it. Their goal was no longer to capture it. This final fight was about annihilation. Every gun was aimed at the lone ship, and then Almeida's fleet hit it with everything they had. It took several volleys, but finally the last ship was reduced to burning splinters. The Battle of Diu was over. Almeida's victory was absolute. As the sun set on February 3, 1509, the Portuguese counted 32 dead and over 400 wounded. Many of their ships were heavily damaged. Their adversaries, on the other hand, had it much worse. Every Mamluk ship was captured or destroyed. 4 Gujarati Carracks were captured, and nearly 400 Mamluk warriors and 1,400 of Diu's men were killed. Francisco de Almeida, however, was not done. Crowley's account describes what is nothing less than bloodlust. Quote, Almeida did not want Diu. He considered it to be impossible to defend with his existing forces. Instead, he demanded substantial compensation and terrible revenge, which he got. Malik Ayaz had to surrender all the Mamluks he was sheltering in the city to a variety of ghastly fates. Some had their hands and feet chopped off. Others were burned alive in a great pyre. Some were tied to the mouth of cannons and blasted to pieces, or put shackled into captured ships that were sunk by gunfire. The city gates were then decorated with bloody rosaries of dismembered body parts. If the outcome of Diu was perhaps inevitable, its consequences were profound. It destroyed once and for all the credibility of the Mamluk sultans and Muslim hopes that the Portuguese could be swept from the sea. The Franks were to be in the Indian Ocean to stay. End quote. The true legacy and importance of the Battle of Diu is still debated, but it's hard to argue that it didn't have at least a few lasting ramifications. Some historians strongly feel that it set the stage for Portuguese dominance in the Indian Ocean, which in turn would lead to one of the greatest trade empires in history. They'd go on to say that the trade routes that were established and the knowledge that was obtained set a new normal that would lead the way to globalization. What's more, every European power, either impressed or envious of Portugal's success, would be also keen to cash in on a similar experience. But perhaps it's best that we go back to 1509. Amir Hussein, the Mamluk admiral, would return to Egypt, ironically, on horseback. He'd eventually be given another command, but would be killed by his own first officer. The Mamluks would never again seriously threaten Portuguese interests. In time, they themselves would be conquered by the Ottomans in 1517. Malik Ayaz would live on as governor of Diu. He'd always be looking for a way, any way, to preserve his city. He would die there in 1522, surrounded by wealth and opulence. The Zamorin of Calicut retreated his forces after the Battle of Diu. His city would continue to be defiant against European expansion, but the days of Calicut being an independent power were numbered. Francisco de Almeida returned to Cochin an empty man. He had nothing left. His wife had died years before, his son was dead, and his revenge was complete. He relinquished his position as viceroy, and in December of 1509, when the winds were favorable, he departed India and was destined never to return. As he made his return journey, he knew that his status in the eyes of King Manuel were tarnished. If he made it back to Lisbon, he figured that at best he'd be facing political exile, and at worst, arrest, imprisonment, and even execution. But he was fated never to return to his homeland. In March of 1510, just beyond the Cape of Good Hope, he was killed by a native African tribe in a minor skirmish over cattle. His men managed to recover his body, and he was interred in a small, humble grave in Cape Town. However, it is said that a tombstone was made for him back in Portugal. His epitaph would read, "Here lies Dom Francisco de Almeida, Viceroy of India, who never lied and who never fled."